The second stage of contract formation is the acceptance of an offer by the offeree. An offeror is the person who makes an offer, and the offeree is the person who can create the contract by accepting the offer. The purpose of this presentation is to provide general information about accepting an offer. This presentation includes basic concepts relating to accepting an offer, the differences between accepting unilateral and bilateral contracts, complications that arise when accepting contracts, and an explanation of the Mailbox Rule. An acceptance is a clear and unequivocal articulation of agreeing to the offer of another person. The ability of an offeree to accept is determined by the offer. An offeror can give the power of acceptance to a single person, a specific group of people, a class of people, or anyone that meets the requirements of the offer. The offer will determine whether the offeree can accept by words or performance. Unless the offer specifically states otherwise, the offer may be accepted in any reasonable manner. Finally, the offeree still must know of the offer and agree to the terms of the offer to be a valid acceptance. Let's look at unilateral versus bilateral contracts. A unilateral contract is a contract where the offeror makes a promise in exchange for an act. An offeree accepts a unilateral offer by performing the requested act. Bilateral contract is where the offeror makes a promise in return for a promise to do something in the future. An offeree accepts a bilateral contract by promising to do something. Unilateral and bilateral contracts have different complications that can affect contract formation. Therefore, it's necessary to determine at the outset whether a contract is unilateral or bilateral in nature. Consider the following examples. Eric wants to have his fence painted by Dan. Eric calls Dan and says, "If but only if you paint my fence blue, then I'll pay you $150. This anticipates a unilateral contract, because Eric promised to pay Dan once he painted the fence. Alternatively, Eric could have said to Dan, "If you tell me that you're going to paint my fence, then I'll pay you $150. This anticipates a bilateral contract, because Eric has promised to pay Dan in return for Dan agreeing to paint the fence. In the real world, Eric will probably just say, "Dan, will you paint my fence for $150? Since it's unclear whether this anticipates a bilateral or unilateral contract, the law allows Dan to accept it by either painting the fence or promising to paint the fence in the future. In order to accept, Dan must either just start painting the fence or tell Eric that he will paint the fence. In such a case, the offer is presumed to anticipate a bilateral contract. In general, where it's unclear what type of response is anticipated, the presumption is that a bilateral contract is anticipated, because people generally don't want to be bound unless the offeree to the contract is also bound. First, let's take a look at complications of unilateral contracts. First, what happens if the offeree doesn't know of the offer? Contract law requires that an offeree know of the offer before it can be accepted. Thus, if the offeree doesn't know of the offer, it cannot be accepted. For example, say that Company A, a railroad company, offers a reward to anyone who catches a criminal. Drew apprehends the criminal and brings him to justice. After taking the criminal to the courthouse, he learns that there was a reward offered for the criminal's capture. Drew cannot recover because he apprehended the criminal when he did not know of the offer. In some circumstances, the offeree can learn of the offer while he's in the process of contemplating the requested performance. If that happens, he still can accept the offer. For example, say that Company A posts a message on the company's internal website offering a bonus to any employee who completes 6 months of work. 3 months after being hired, Mary learns of the offer. While the bonus may not have been Mary's initial reason for working, it could be the reason she continues to work for the company. Therefore, if she completes the required 6 months, then she has accepted the offer by fully performing the requested act. A unilateral contract requires no acceptance. The offeree merely performs to make the offer enforceable. However, the offeror must at least be notified once performance has been completed. The offeree can notify the offeror or at least make a reasonable attempt to do so. Likewise, if the offeror learns that the performance has been completed from another source, that is also sufficient to make the offer enforceable. While the general principle is that offers can always be revoked, part performance of a unilateral contract makes the offer irrevocable. For example, if Eric makes a unilateral offer to pay Dan $150 if he paints Eric's fence, then Dan's commencing the paint job makes the offer irrevocable. The reason for this is self-evident. It wouldn't be fair to allow Eric to revoke the offer when Dan is halfway through painting the fence. Once the offeree has begun performance, he has a reasonable period of time to complete the job. During this time, and until the performance is completed or until a reasonable time has passed, the offer cannot be revoked. Generally, an offeree must communicate an acceptance for a bilateral offer. However, there are some exceptions to this, when silence can also be considered acceptance to a bilateral contract. First, the offeree's silence can act as an acceptance when the offeree renders a service with the reasonable expectation of being paid. For example, say that Dan offers to pay Eric for 30 dance lessons, and without communicating an acceptance, Eric gives the first few dance lessons to Dan. This could be considered an acceptance to perform all 30 lessons. Dan knows that Eric expects to be paid, and even if Dan is silent, his conduct shows that he has accepted Eric's offer. Therefore, the offer is considered accepted. Second, if the offer states that silence can be a form of acceptance, and it can be shown that the offeree intends to accept, then the offer can be silently accepted. Third, if because of previous dealings between the parties where silence was considered acceptance, this creates a reasonable expectation that silence will be an acceptance, then also the silence can be considered an acceptance. For an acceptance to be valid, it generally must be identical to the offer. This is commonly referred to as the mirror image rule. If the acceptance is not a mirror image of the offer, it is considered a rejection and a counteroffer that can be accepted by the original offeror. For example, imagine that Eric asks, Dan, will you agree to paint my fence blue for $150? And Dan replies, green is a better color. If I paint it green, will you pay me $150? Eric says, okay, I'll pay you $150 to paint my fence green. There is a binding contract. In this case, Dan did not accept Eric's first offer. Instead, he rejected it and made a counteroffer, which Eric then accepted. However, the mirror image rule applies only when referring to services contracts or contracts for the sale of real estate. Contracts for the sale of goods are governed by the Uniform Commercial Code, which is a series of rules written by experts in contract law that have been adopted in whole or in part by all 50 states. The UCC changes the mirror image rule in cases of contracts for the sale of goods. The UCC structure is more complex and is the subject of a different presentation, but just keep in mind that the mirror image rule does not apply in cases involving contracts for the sale of goods. Finally, let's look at the Mailbox Rule. The Mailbox Rule determines when a written acceptance is effective. The Mailbox Rule provides that when an acceptance is delivered to the Postal Service or is sent through a similar reasonable medium, such as email, it's effective when dispatched. Other communications that are involved in contract formation, such as offers, rejections, and revocations, are effective only upon receipt by the recipient of the communication. The practical effect of this is that after the acceptance has been sent out, the offer can no longer revoke it. For example, if Eric writes to Alex, Alex, if you agree to paint my fence blue, then I'll pay you $150. Alex writes and then mails a letter to Eric that says, yes, I will paint your fence blue for $150. Alex has accepted the offer when he mailed the letter. At this point, Eric can no longer revoke the offer. Although the speed of modern communications has decreased the importance of the Mailbox Rule, it should be noted for cases in which emails are delayed in cyberspace or something similar, that the Mailbox Rule also applies to electronic communications. Acceptance is the second stage in contract formation. Always remember that acceptance and potential complications created by acceptances will differ depending on the type of contract anticipated.